How's it going, everybody? In this video, I'm going to be doing a review of the book Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert. So, Stumbling on Happiness is best for those who have a deep interest in psychology. It only has a couple sort of relevant tips for being able to increase happiness, and it really heavily focuses on the mechanics of the mind and sort of psychology and some of the mechanics of happiness without a whole lot on how to actually improve your happiness, right? There's not a lot of practical advice. So, it's mostly for those interested in psychology, though there are a couple useful tools in here. The difficulty to digest is really fairly easy. It does lean pretty heavily on psychological literature, so there's a good amount of terminology that you may not be familiar with, and it kind of talks with some familiarity in that realm, but it's really still not that hard to digest even if you don't have any sort of background, because a lot of the terms are explained and then used moving forward. On to the key insights. So Stumbling on Happiness sort of starts with this really straightforward assertion that the book is not really about how to improve or increase your happiness. It's more about sort of the mechanics behind happiness and what things impact your happiness and how the mind works. It then goes on to talk about how humans are unique from other animals because they are very good at being able to sort of project into the future in a way that other animals don't really. The piece that kind of stood out for me was sort of this more emotional projection, right? So animals and stuff can do projection into the future around, oh, this is where I found food before, so I guess I'll go here to look for food again, really relying on their memory. But humans can sort of do this thing where I think about, okay, if I go to this party, how am I going to feel while I'm there, right? It's a much deeper and more complex way of looking at things. And we may find that this is true or not true in the future. It's kind of hard to prove or disprove around animals, but basically that's the idea, is that we're really good at being able to project into the future. Now, the problem with that, Gilbert suggests, is that we're actually not very good at doing that around happiness, right? We can project into the future, but a lot of the things that we come up with actually lead us away from happiness instead of towards it. The next major section sort of tries to unpack what happiness is or how we understand it. Gilbert talks about how hard it is to measure, right? Because we all only have our own experience of happiness. So there are some questions that come up around, what is happiness? And since there's no objective way of measuring it, how are we supposed to know or believe anyone else when they say they're happy? He uses the example of conjoined twins, and basically if we imagine being conjoined twins, we think, oh, I wouldn't be happy if I suddenly was attached to someone else. But what these people actually report is a level of happiness, right? A relatively high level of happiness. And there's no way to know if, they're correct, they're experiencing the same level of happiness, or if their range is more narrow, right? They're at the top of their range, but it's actually more narrow than everyone else's, or what's really going on with that experience compared to what everyone else is experiencing. And then this example can kind of be propagated out to everyone, right? I don't know how anyone else's experience is, so when they say they're happy, at the face of it, it's kind of hard to understand what that experience is objectively. He also talks a little bit about the differences between happiness in terms of just pleasure and happiness in terms of eudaimonia, or like a sense of purpose and meaning, and how those two pieces are a little bit different and sort of get jumbled up. So Stumbling on Happiness then sort of moves into a combination of those two things, right? So how we project about happiness and how our brains sort of work and how that works. And the idea here is basically that we create projections by using our memories. Now, the problem with memory is that a lot of people think, oh, I remember things, kind of like a computer or something, right? It saves the exact file, exactly what was seen, like a video recording or something. But in reality, our memories don't really work that way. They sort of have bits and pieces of information, and then our brains reconstruct it. And every time we try to remember something, we're reconstructing it. So the way we end up reconstructing the details is pretty important. And for projecting into the future, we use sort of the same sorts of systems in our brain. So a lot of times those projections are flawed with sort of this construction model, right? Again, we're not using the exact recreation of the event. We're using a bunch of models and heuristics and things to try to remake those. So for a more tangible example, our current situations can color our projections. So for example, there's studies that if you overeat a whole bunch of food right now, your projection of how likely it is that you will want or enjoy food tomorrow is colored by that perception, right? You are going to answer that you think it will be less enjoyable than it really will be, or less enjoyable than it would be if you do the exact same sort of task while hungry. And, if we were objective, we would have the same sort of estimation regardless of our current circumstance, because we'd be able to go, oh, well, in the future, roughly most days, I'm about this hungry, this thing sounds about this good. But that's not how it works. Our construction system uses some of the information that we're currently experiencing to sort of color what we think that future experience will be. One particularly interesting note in this section is the idea of experiencing variety and how that's useful towards happiness. And it is brought up that what you should choose in terms of variety really depends on the temporal distance. Now, what I mean by that is if you're going to eat at a restaurant once a month, it's probably best to always choose the thing that you think is really good because there's space in between each instance of choice. But if you're going to eat at a restaurant every single day, you're going to want to switch it up and have a bunch of variety. And we're not super great at predicting or projecting some of these things because sometimes we get them mixed up. Again, sort of using our current situation to project into the future. But there is some research around that, and basically, if you're going to have the same type of experience in close proximity in terms of time, then you're going to want to have more variety. And if you're going to really spread it out, then the thing that makes you the most happy or that you enjoy most is going to be the best choice. It's not an idea I've seen other places. I'm sure it exists other places, but I found that particularly interesting. Okay, the next major section of the book talks about sort of the psychological immune system. And the idea here is that when bad things happen, we have sort of a system in our brains that tries to rationalize and figure those things out and make meaning of them and just figure out, a purpose around that. And the stronger, the more negative the event, the more likely this system is to come online and sort of help us figure out a way to interpret this situation that gives some sort of meaning. So, an example might be like, you probably heard a lot of people say their worst experiences are some of the most meaningful. Like people have divorce and then they feel like it was super difficult for them, but at the same time they feel like it was one of the most meaningful things that they've done. And so it's this sort of immune system, as Gilbert puts it, a psychological immune system that kicks in and tries to help you figure out a way to frame that's going to be productive so you don't have to feel all that pain all the time every time you think about it. On sort of a related note, ambiguity in situations increases the emotional duration and intensity. So something like if someone were to cut you off in traffic, right, that has a higher emotional content than if you had your windows rolled down and the person said like, hey, is it all right if I go in front of you because I am late for something? Whatever. You know what's going on. So you can kind of exploit this by, when you're facing ambiguous situations, choosing the most positive angle you can find to create the most happiness. All right, the final sections include sort of social implications of happiness. And one of the major ideas is that a lot of these happiness myths perpetuate because they're good for passing genes along. So, for example, the idea that having children will make you happier. When you do studies of moment by moment happiness, parents are less happy than they were before having kids. So it's sort of this idea that we have these social ideas that kind of get passed around that may or may not actually increase happiness, but continue to be passed around because they increase the chance of procreation and being able to pass themselves on. One other note in the social implications is Gilbert says we're actually really good at projecting happiness and some of these other states when we look at other people, right? If we think about how other people act in the same sort of situation, it's actually a really good proxy for what our experience is going to be. But there's a lot of resistance against this because we all kind of feel like, oh, well, I'm an individual, I'm different. So these reports won't necessarily apply to me. I'm more different than these people are. But it looks like, based on his research, in a lot of situations, that's just not correct. And we end up responding roughly equivalently. Or at least that's the best method we have for getting an approximation, because the projections that we make tend out to be wrong quite often. All right, final opinion. Overall, I found the book pretty interesting. I obviously like psychology quite a bit, so I think there was a lot of unique and useful information, a lot of research I think it's worth reading if you like psychology or are interested in the mechanics of happiness, but it's going to be a little less useful if you're looking for, okay, here's a guide and a bunch of strategies and tactics that I can adopt to become happier. You're not going to find that in here, and it's basically said right at the start of the book that's not what this book is. All right, other considerations. So, Stumbling on Happiness kind of reads like an intro psych. Maybe not textbook because it's not that dry, but the same sort of feeling, right? There's a lot of psych terms, a lot of stuff is explained. It's not too heavy or overwhelming, but it's definitely on the educational side and draws on a lot of research. Another thing that I found interesting was that it kind of spends a chunk of time talking about how it's hard to measure objective happiness. If you're just trying to figure out happiness and become happier, it doesn't really matter what the objective outcomes are, right? As a scientist who wants access to the truth, yes, it makes a difference. But as far as the average person, the day to day, if conjoined twins say that they're happier, but others predict that they wouldn't be that happy as conjoined twins, then obviously the experience of the person should have more weight. So, interesting piece, but for the average person that's not trying to be a scientist and get to truth, it doesn't really matter if we have an objective way of measuring it. It just matters what other people tell us and how we feel. Just different angles to take it from. One thing I did find a little strange in this book, and maybe it's just an angle, but Gilbert takes quite a few pot shots at our ability to actually increase and influence our happiness. And while there are some instances where that's true and some projections where it doesn't quite work out in the way that, we predict, there are clearly a lot of actions that we can take that produce or diminish happiness. And so while there's maybe some ambiguous situations, there are lots and lots of things that have a bunch of studies around them that can increase happiness. So I just found it a little strange that he took so many shots against it when there is also research showing, in a lot of realms, we definitely can make choices that will improve our happiness. And one last piece that I wanted to touch on, going back to the children bring happiness piece, I thought that was an interesting study to bring up to show that sort of these myths move around that don't necessarily produce happiness. Because I've got to imagine, yes, you do the study, you ask people moment by moment how happy they are. The thing you're tapping into is sort of the joy or emotional happiness or the sense of pleasure, right? You're not tapping into the eudaimonia or the sense of purpose. And I would imagine the vast majority of parents are not going to say, oh, like I didn't get any boost in purpose from this. I just got a net negative in joy, right? It's just weird that he kind of anchored on this, where it's clearly laid out elsewhere in the book that happiness is not just about this hedonic pleasure, right? It's also about sort of meaning. So, doing this study, if you ask something like "How happy are you now?" to parents, they're probably going to lean towards sort of this emotional response. But if you ask them something about like how meaningful are the actions you took today or the actions you're taking now, you're probably going to get a different answer. So while on the surface, a study like that might seem like it captures happiness, in actuality, you have to use a more robust definition to sort of understand the holistic picture of general human experience, because it wouldn't make sense, if people would have kids and then be like, well, this sucks the whole time, but it didn't provide any meaning. You have to factor in that meaning can be something that people are willing to undergo unpleasant experiences to produce. So meaning in itself should be part of what you factor into happiness, or at least that's on a holistic level. When people talk about being happy, there are a number of different ways that you can mean that, and one of them is through purpose. So a lot of times there's this trade-off. Anyway, I just thought that was worth highlighting because these sort of myths wouldn't be able to stay perpetuated if they didn't produce some sort of meaning. On to the applicable content. 1. What could you do to be happier tomorrow? How are your current thoughts and feelings influencing that idea? 2. Think of a negative major event from your life. What's one possible positive interpretation? 3. What happy person can you mirror to increase happiness in your life? So, all in all, I think it's a pretty good book. A lot of interesting and new information. Some of it's useful, some of it's purely just scientific or research or whatever else. But I love that kind of stuff. So if you like that or are interested in it, I think it's a good book to pick up. That's all I've got for this video. As always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, throw them down in the box below. I'll get to them as soon as I can, and
Thanks for
I'll see you next
watching.
time.
If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.